But for now, let's actually transition here and start using JavaScript in some way. But let me point out one thing. So think way back to week 0. We had the notion of events in Scratch. And you could broadcast an event, and then you could wait for an event. And we had that very simple Marco Polo example way back when in week 0, where when you hit the space bar, Marco would say his name and broadcast an event. And the girl that was also a separate sprite would wait for that event. Upon receiving that event, she would then say Polo. So events were this way of having two different programs, or two different sprites in that case, communicate. Well, similarly as web programming, asynchronous like that. You have lots of going on modern web pages, and you don't necessarily want to wait for the user's input for something to happen or something to change. You, the website, might want to push more data to the server and say, here's a status update. Or Gmail, here's a new email that you have. And so you have in HTML associated with all of these elements we've been using thus far, anchor tags and divs and paragraphs and inputs and select menus. You actually have a whole suite of events that can be triggered. And this is a non-exhaustive list, but some of the most common ones, and most of them kind of are self-explanatory. For instance, on mouse over is an event that is triggered on any HTML tag when you so much as hover your mouse cursor over that element. Now, typically, if you just wave your mouse over a div or over a paragraph of text on a web page that you made for, say, PSET 7, nothing happens. But with JavaScript, can you tell the browser, I would like to listen for this mouse over event? And you might recall on many websites, anytime you hover over some text or graphic, what sometimes happens before you actually click? Right, something changes, right? It might become highlighted. It might change to another graphic. It might become bold. Something might change. And that's because of JavaScript typically. CSS, you can work some of these tricks these days too. But with JavaScript, you can do anything because you can detect the fact that the mouse is now over some element in the page, some div or some paragraph, some button, and you can do something. And you can even then detect when the mouse is out of the range of that tag. So you can have things become big and then small, or black and then white, or any kinds of changes you might want to happen. You can listen to keystrokes, on key down, on key up, on key press. These are actually used by CS50 Shuttle so that when you do hit the arrow keys or W or A or the like, we, the JavaScript code in that implementation, are listening for those events. And when we hear you pushing the up arrow, just like in Scratch, we do something. We move the camera or we move the shuttle in that case. And there's yet others on submit, on select, on resize, on click, and so forth. This means that we can listen for all of this. So let me go into the appliance here and open up gedit with a file called form1.html. And this is going to be a very simple form that submits only to a file called dump.php, which does nothing interesting. I just wanted a page to which I could submit all these forms that would just show me what fields had been submitted. So it's not really a dynamic website. It's just some diagnostic output. So let me go ahead and look at what this thing looks like. If I go into form1.html, we will see a little form like this. So pretty typical, an email field, password, again password, and then I need to somehow agree to these terms and conditions. Unfortunately, if I submit this form right now, nothing actually happens in a good way because it does submit the form. It submits no values for those three fields. It doesn't even send the checkbox field because it wasn't checked. And so what could I do? Well, just like with the frosh.im's examples last week, I could yell at the user, right? This PHP file could notice this field equals the empty string. This field also equals the empty string, quote unquote. So let's yell at the user in red. But JavaScript is nicer in that we can detect this even before you click submit. And this is increasingly compelling because you don't want to have to submit, maybe wait a second or two while your slow laptop or slow internet connection actually sends the form to the server, only then to be told, sorry, you screwed up, try again. It'd be much nicer if we could instantaneously tell the user, wait a minute, you forgot to do something important. So we can add a bit of client-side validation. In version 2 of form, let me go ahead and try that same thing where I just submit a blank form. And now notice the website's yelling at me. It's sort of using a very coarse trick, using an alert menu, as it's called, but it's at least now preventing me from submitting the form, and it's explaining why. So I click OK, and now notice I did not, in fact, end up at dump.php. I'm still at the original URL. So it seems like with JavaScript, you can listen for an event like onSubmit. And if you decide, wait a minute, I don't want to submit because you have not you have not inputted everything I want, you can short circuit that connection. And frankly, increasingly these days, you have Android phones, Windows phones, iPhones, and the like. These are not the fastest internet connections, especially when you're on 3G or similar. So the avoidance of this round trip time that could be 2, 3, maybe even 5 or more seconds is increasingly compelling to try to do it all on the client side to speed up the user's experience. So let's see how this is actually working. In form2.html, we'll see the same HTML as was in the other form. So let's just look at this version because it's identical to before, almost identical to before. And now notice we have a body tag. We have a form tag whose action is, as promised, dump.php. We're just using get because it doesn't really matter for this. But notice I've given this form a name. So that's a little new. So name equals quote unquote registration because this is a registration form. But notice this too, another HTML attribute. OnSubmit equals quote unquote return validate. So we seem now to be calling code inside of an attribute's value in HTML. And we'll see that there's actually cleaner ways to do this, and we'll get there. But for now, this seems to be saying call a function called validate with no arguments, and then return its value. And what HTML is designed to do is if this function, validate, returns false, what's going to happen? The form will not, in fact, get submitted. Only if that function returns true will the form proceed to go to the server. Now, the rest of this is old hat now. So we've got an email field, which is type text, password field, which is type password, another one for password, and then an input type equals checkbox. So everything else is the same, but I do have a submit button. So indeed, when the user hits enter or clicks that button, that function, validate, is going to get called. Well, if we scroll up, notice that we've introduced a new feature into the head of this web page. Inside of the head usually is not only the title tag, but now we also have a script tag. And the default language these days is assumed to be JavaScript, even though back in the day others were sometimes used. But for now, this is pretty much the de facto standard. And inside of this script tag, we actually have programming code. Not C, not PHP, not HTML. This is now JavaScript. And this is more verbose than we're going to need to be ultimately. But let's see what this function does. So just as in PHP, you must literally say function and then the name of the function. And it takes no arguments in this case. Then we have the promised syntax of if conditions, which look pretty much the same. But this is a little new. So it turns out that per this picture here, whereby you have a so-called document node at the very top, sort of the grandparent of this whole tree structure. Similarly, in JavaScript, you have access to a special global variable called document. And it's specifically an object, which means inside of document are a whole bunch of key value pairs. Now, for now, you can just simplify this. Inside of the document object is another object called forms. And this forms object is just an object containing any of the HTML forms that are in this web page. There might be 0, there might be 1. In this case, there's 1. And if you then go .registration, this means give me the form whose name is registration in this particular web page. And then you can kind of continue the logic fairly intuitively. .email means get me the email field in that form called registration in this web page. And then lastly, because the email field is really referring to an input element, we really care about its value. So value equals quote unquote something. So we say .value. And finally, after traversing this very long hierarchy of objects, but arguably intuitive hierarchy, we're checking does that value equal the empty string? Because if so, we want to yell at the user. So a very simple way of yelling at the user, even though it's not the prettiest way because different browsers create different aesthetic windows, alert literally just alerts the user with a modal window, which means you can't do anything until you click OK in this window. And I'm returning false, moreover, to make sure that not only am I yelling at the user, I'm short-circuiting the form's submission. Now, the rest of these are somewhat intuitive based on that explanation. So even though the syntax is, again, a little verbose, document.forms.registration.password1, this was the first of my password fields, .value equals quote unquote nothing. I'm going to yell at them for not providing a password. But just like in most websites, if the user screwed up their password second time and I did not type the same value for password 1 as I did for password 2, I'm going to yell at them again, but slightly differently. You must provide the same password twice. So again, this is just basic logic now that we might have used in C a few weeks back. But notice the difference. Just like in PHP, if we want to compare strings, we do not need to jump through the hoops of something like strcmp. We recall we had to avoid this issue of pointers in C and comparing pointers instead of strings very nicely in PHP and in JavaScript. And in a lot of these so-called higher level languages, when you say equals equals and you're comparing strings, that's going to do a literal string comparison in the manner that you would have expected. And then lastly, notice this. It's slightly different from a text field, but I'm saying else if it's not the case that document.forms.registration.agreement, agreement is the name I gave to the checkbox, .checked. So if it's not checked, that's a checkbox, so it actually has a Boolean property called checked, which is either true or false. So if it's not checked, I'm going to yell at them for not agreeing to our terms and conditions, return false. Otherwise, if they passed all of those tests in that gauntlet, I'm going to go ahead and say return true. And what happens then? The user submits the form OK. Yeah? Do you have to specify the return type of a JavaScript function? No. So just as in PHP, it's very loosely typed, so you do not specify the return type. You literally say function and then the name of the function. You can. So PHP and JavaScript are messy in that, as you point out, you could return true or false or 3 or 5 or quote unquote hello. You can indeed return different data types in these languages. Sometimes that's advantageous. PHP takes great use of this, but it's also potentially a bad thing, especially when if you want to return a number like 0, but you might also want to return false, you get into interesting predicaments if you don't distinguish those two cases properly. But for the most part, it tends to expedite development and generally be a helpful thing, even if inelegant. Yeah?
So given that you're returning false if any of those conditions are true, what work does writing else if do rather than just writing false?
Good question. None whatsoever. So I was just being kind of anal, trying to keep it clear to me that only one of these is really going to matter. But because we are returning false immediately, we could get rid of all of those else ifs. Either way would be fine. Yeah? Good question. Thankfully, no. So question is, when you return false, does the browser clear the form? No. It leaves it exactly as is. So this is in contrast with some behaviors of websites whereby once you submit, they get to the next page, you're yelled at, then you click back. Sometimes then, if the page has not been designed to be cached, you would lose all of your inputs. This leaves everything the way it was. Just doesn't allow the form submission. So